Maranatha. And there we go. It'll work. So if you notice, we're down a man today. Joe is no longer with us today.
Better clarify that.
Yeah. No, he's at home. His son is getting married on Saturday, so they have family coming in. So he's getting everything ready for that and taking care of his family. So he's got next week off as well. So he finally gets both kids married, good to go, and really excited for him. So if you think about it, pray for Brian and his new bride and Joe and Kim as well. So before we start off, just per usual, just some announcements to go through quickly. November 15th, we have a lot, right? That weekend, 13, 14, 15. So 13, 14, we have the TES seminar. You can schedule or register online. You can go to the seminary's website, just expositors.org, and you can register that way. And then that'll be a small fee. I think it's $20, and then that'll be Friday and Saturday, and then that Sunday we have our men's training after church. But what's before? Is it?
We have a new visitor reception that day. We have an opportunity for anyone who's new with us in the last few weeks or months. If you would like to just spend a little time getting to know our elders and wives, we'd love to meet you upstairs in the first classroom. That'll be during the equipping hour. And then also on the 15th, we have communion. So please be preparing your heart for that. And then we're also taking the harvest offering on the 15th as well. So you could be, if you would be preparing your heart to contribute to that if at all possible. And then actually one thing this coming Sunday we probably should mention is the Street family is here. They're here, at least Jeff and Tonda are, and they'll be with us at our church on Sunday. And Jeff will be doing an update during the equipping hour on his ministry in Quebec, Canada, and so we encourage you to join us for that. I will not be here this Sunday. I'm actually going to be helping Matt Hilbert's ordination council over in Farmington, and so looking forward to participating in that. Matt was an intern here for a few years, and looking forward to being on his ordination council, and then I'll be preaching at his church on Sunday. So you'll be filling the pulpit here this Sunday.
We're filling the pulpit, yeah. So big pulpit to fill. So, and then so the Streets, Jeff will have the whole equipping hour. So kids will have their normal classes, but we're putting a pause on the Old Testament historical books. That way Jeff has an opportunity to share with you guys. You can ask some questions. So he'll have the full 45 minutes to be able to share. So we really want to encourage you guys to go and check him out, see the ministry that he's doing, kind of the an update on what's going on in Canada. So I think that's it with regards to announcements, but we want to continue looking at Body Life Ministry, and we have a ton of topics. We would certainly appreciate if you guys had any topics that you wanted to discuss. What we're trying to do is get down into the local church, and not just the local church, but this local church, and be able to help really shepherd you and answer questions that you have about anything and to do with body life and body life ministry.
So basically what we're doing is we're trying to think through what are the various scenarios that happen in the life of a church.
That's right.
What are some of the different situations you might come up against or we might come up against? What are some of the common things that you're going to experience just in the life of a church? And so that's kind of what this little series is about that we're doing. So
yeah, that's good. And so we don't so as we look at these things and we go through the various topics, don't think, oh man, they're talking about me, why are they talking about me? We're just randomly picking things. So if it is about you, perhaps that's the conviction of the Holy Spirit falling upon you. But anyway, without further ado, this morning we're asking the question really, how can I resolve conflict in the church? How can I resolve conflict in the church? So, first of all, there's always going to be conflict within the church. So we would never put our heads in the sand and pretend like the church is perfect. None of us are perfect. So the church in and of itself, as we are part of it here, we're going to, every once in a while, buck heads with people or whatever it is, rub somebody the wrong way or they rub us the wrong way. So I want to start out with just defining what this means by conflict. I think sometimes when people think conflict, they think like fighting or some kind of physical alteration or yelling at one another. But we'll just start with, simply put, is when you're not in unity and fellowship with somebody else in the body. And so that would be you're having a conflict between the two of you, though it may not be open and public. There's something going on inside your heart, something going on inside their heart that's stopping you from fulfilling the commands to maintain the unity in the body. What else would you add for conflict?
Yeah, I would just add that this is a natural byproduct of being in relationships with fellow sinners. It happens in our individual homes because we live in such close quarters, and the same thing happens in the church as well. That when you put believers together into the church, we are going to at times sin against each other. It is inevitable. And so, sometimes it could be over doctrinal issues where we disagree. Sometimes it could be over personal preferences. Sometimes it could be over just words that were said or whatever. There's a multiple source of these conflicts, but the issue here is not so much to define the source as much as it is to say that we are going to at times just be in conflict with one another, and that shouldn't surprise us.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we get a little surprised, like this shouldn't happen in the church. And actually, it's normal. It's normal for this kind of interaction to occur. So I just think we want to be careful we don't get surprised at it, but how we handle it, of course, is going to be the key issue.
Yeah, and I would also add that it's okay to have conflict sometimes within the church itself, and that's how we can work things out. So just because we say conflict doesn't necessarily always carry negative connotations with it. And so you're able to discuss and argue and work things out, but then what we're going to get into is where our heart has to be when we're doing those things. So we're not attacking the individual. We're not looking to just win an argument or get our own point across, but we have to go into it with our hearts ready to submit and ready to be humble. So,
and I would just add to that, Bob, that there's so many passages in Scripture that deal with this issue.
Oh yeah.
The sheer number of biblical texts that address unity in the body should make us realize just how significant an issue this is.
That's right.
So this is not really a minor issue. Psalm 133 says how blessed it is when brothers dwell in unity. Come to the book of Acts, and you look at what's taking place in the book of Acts. They're one heart, one mind throughout the whole book for the most part. 1 Corinthians 1:10, Paul says, let there be no divisions among you. You come to the book of Philippians, which is essentially a book of unity, and just the numerous exhortations, chapter 1:27, chapter 2, verse 2, over in chapter 4. You come to the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 3. You come to the end of Romans, chapter 12, and there's just one passage after the other. There's all the one another passages that relate to this topic as well. And so all of that just reminds us that this is just part of body life. And so the issue is, number one, recognizing it, not being surprised by it, but at the same time being willing to work through it in a biblical fashion.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, the Bible certainly has a lot to say, and it's almost like God knew where two people were going to be together, there was going to be conflict.
You think?
And then you put 300 or whatever in here, you're bound to have something. So, and then you see Philippians. In Philippians we see that right away. Euodia and Syntyche, and Paul says, "I urge you, these two ladies, to live in harmony in the Lord." So there was something going on between them, and Paul just said, "Look, you need to strive to live in harmony." He even kind of enlisted some help that was there at the church to work with these two ladies. So it's so important that we're able to understand that there is going to be this coming, and that we're going to have to actually work on it. So our first reaction shouldn't be just to run from any kind of strife, maybe in the church, but we need to look at how are we preparing our hearts before we have that confrontation. So a little scenario: you come to church and somebody says something or somebody does something and you get hurt, and your heart hurts, or you're starting to build this scenario in your mind of what they're saying and kind of reading into it. But in any effect, not necessarily a sin, but it certainly was something that is chewing on you, right? And so you think, man, I just need to go talk to that person. So what are some steps we can take before we actually go and have that confrontation?
Well, I think the first thing, even before you kind of move down the road towards confrontation, the first thing you need to wrestle through is, can I overlook this offense? Or does it need to be addressed? And those are really the only two options when it comes to believers handling conflict with one another. There's no third option. There's no middle option. There's no, I'm going to stew on this for a while, or I'm going to become bitter, or I'm going to leave the church, or, there's really only two biblical options. One is you overlook it, or number two is you confront it. So I think even before you get to the confrontation stage, I think we each need to ask ourselves the question, can I overlook this? You come to Proverbs 19, verse 11, which says it's to one's glory to overlook an offense. 1 Peter 4:8 says love covers a multitude of transgressions or sins. And so I think when possible, we should try to overlook it. We should try to just let it love, cover that sin. We should move on. By doing that, though, we're absolutely moving on. We're saying, you know what, there are certain circumstances that person was dealing with, or that's out of character for them, or maybe I was a little impatient in that situation, or whatever. I just think if there's a way to overlook it, if there's a way to just bury it and just extend grace and move past that in your own heart, if you can do that, I think that's the best case scenario.
Which is the proverbial higher road, right? Like you're saying, sure, I may have been wronged, or sure, I may have been this, but at the end of the day, I just want to get past this. And that I love 1 Corinthians 6:7, and when Paul's talking about lawsuits and whatever, and he says, actually, then it is already a defeat for you that you have lawsuits with one another. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? And I think, man, the attitude that we could have is, why not just let this go? Like, why worry about my reputation? Why worry about these things and making sure that I'm right? I can just let that go. So you are right. There's only two options, because the third option is actually sin, right? Exactly. To sit and have that bitterness sit within you. So you either have to let it go. Now, that is what our TES seminar is about, right? Like forgiveness.
Yeah. And
so I'm sure he's gonna hit on that. But so when we let that go, so say we take option A, we decide to let that go, then we can't claim that ever again.
Exactly. By letting it go, you're letting it go.
Right.
You're not going to stew on it. You're not going to let a root of bitterness creep up in your heart. You're not going to hold that against that individual. You're not going to address it sometime down the road later, and you're going to say, well, when that one time you did this to me. No, you don't drag that back up again. You let it lie. It's done. You move past it. You let grace be granted in that situation. So that is the challenge, is if your heart can't do that, then number one, there could be a sinful propensity on your part to be unwilling to forgive, or it just means you do need to go talk to that person. And so I think that's where we're going next in this conversation.
How do you then go talk to that person? So if you decide, hey, I can't overlook this, I need to go talk to that person, which isn't a sin, by the way, it's perfectly fine. But there are some steps you need to take before you actually get to that person. So as we look at those steps, first of all, I would say that I like Ephesians 6:12 when I think about dealing with people, and it says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against powers of the dark world, against spiritual forces, so on and so forth." So your struggle is not against the individual in the church. Your struggle is with sin, and whether it be your sin or their sin, you can't take it out on the individual, right? And so you need to make sure that when you're going there, you understand that the person that you're going to talk to is just as influenced underneath that sin. Even as a new believer, we can fall, or as a believer, we can fall into the trap of believing the lie. And so they're just under that same thing. So know that you're going to talk to them, but also I would say furthermore, know that you're going to talk to a son or daughter of Christ. Mm-hmm. And so they've been redeemed. And so you need to go there with respect and love and honor. And when you go and talk to them, know that you're talking to someone who is at the same level you are as a believer. You've been saved by the blood of Christ, justified, made righteous, all of those things. So you're not better or worse, but you're going there to resolve a conflict. But what kind of things can we do internally to help ourselves out as we're getting ready to go?
Well, I think this is a time to practice humility. I think, God never wastes anything. And so God may be wanting to do as much in our heart in dealing with that situation as he wants to do in that other person's heart. So these types of circumstances are always opportunities for us to grow in patience. There are always opportunities for us to grow in humility. And so I think that's where I would start is how would God want me to treat this individual? Because they might be wrong and you might be addressing a sin in their life, but that doesn't excuse our approach and how we do that.
That's right.
In other words, we need to respond graciously. They may have sinned against us, but that doesn't give us license to hurt them back. So the issue is, am I going to respond humbly? Am I going to respond kindly? Am I going to respond patiently? These are the virtues that the New Testament prescribes for us. And so, I just think often of 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. The Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but be kind to all, able to teach, patient when wronged, correcting with gentleness those who are in opposition. I just think of some of those words there, not quarrelsome, kind, patient, gentle. Those are the kind of virtues that I think need to prevail in a situation like this. So we need to take the emotion out of it. We also need to take our pride out of it. And I think oftentimes in circumstances like this, our tendency is to defend ourselves.
That's right.
Our tendency is to be right. Our tendency is to prove the other person wrong. We want to come out on top. We want to come out the victor. We want to come out shown to be, the correct one. And frankly, again, God may just wanting us to be more humble. And there's probably areas in our own life that need to be addressed. And there's probably some of the things that we did in that situation contributed to that. There's probably areas that we could still grow in, and maybe some sin we need to repent of in that situation. So I think going in humbly, I think going in with a willingness to listen rather than to blast our cannon. I think the model here by Christ models for us what this is to be like. So a quickness to forgive, a humility to listen, a gentleness in our speech. I think those are the attitudes that we actually need to think about and cultivate before we head into a conversation like that.
Yeah, I would say too, practically, as we're doing that, we have to make sure we don't build a scenario in our mind. And I think oftentimes before we go talk to somebody, I know I consciously, before having confrontation, I need to make sure that I'm not building this whole thing. Well, I'm going to say this and they're going to say this, and I'm going to say this and they're going to say this. So you're building up this whole dialogue and this whole scenario in your mind of how everything's going to go. And I can honestly say maybe 100% of the time it's never gone the way that I've actually built it up to be. And so that's why, someone would say, well, what are you going to say? What are you going to say? I don't know what I'm going to say. I want to hear from them. And so I don't want to go in with a preconceived notion of here's how it's going to have to go and here's what I want to say. I want to go in and lay out, make sure my heart's in the right place. And then the other thing too, and I like how you said humility, and you hit on a couple things there kind of quickly. One of the things you said though was God may be using this in your life to make you more into the image of Christ, essentially is what you said. And I think that's good. I think our perspective sometimes can be, this person wronged me, I need to go and I need to make this right. But it could be, this person wronged me because God wanted to show my heart. And God wanted to show that I had this thing in my heart. And so God has graciously used the other individual to come in and prick my heart right there. And now, and I also like what you said before too, was our responsibility is how we respond, not what happens to us.
Exactly.
So as we grow in Christ's likeness, we think of 1 Peter, and it said, speaking of Christ, who reviled against him did not revile in return. And so that's what our heart has to be like.
That's right.
Is how are we going to respond to those things? So remember, it's we're always, everything that happens to us is happening to us to conform us more into the image of Christ.
That's right.
And so when our mind and our focus is off of Christ and on ourselves and how I've been wrong and how I want to be made right, all of a sudden we're not growing in the image of Christ, we're growing in the image of self, which isn't a good thing.
Yeah, another way to say that is I have not arrived yet in my ability to forgive people.
Yeah.
And I have not arrived yet in exercising gentleness towards those who hurt me. And I have not arrived yet in being patient. And I have not arrived yet in learning to extend grace in difficult situations. And I've not arrived yet in a practice of humility and my pride being confronted, I've not arrived at any of those things. So all of those situations are opportunities for me to grow in those areas. And so I think sometimes we have to, go to take a 40,000 foot look at the situation rather than
Yeah.
in the forest and in the weeds, that all we want to do is confront that individual and make them see how they hurt us. That might be part of it, but part of it also is, what is God wanting to do in me, and how does He want to shape me and grow me? And so that's the part I think that we have to keep in mind even before we get to that conversation.
Yeah, it's good. So now we've made sure our heart's good, made sure everything's clean, made sure that we're going in with the right attitude, and we do have this command, and I like Romans 14:19, and Romans 14:19. We got this nice little command here, and he says, "So then we pursue the things which make for peace and the building up of one another." So now our heart's good. We've decided we want to confront the person. We're on the right track. And, we ask the person maybe go out for coffee or some neutral place or whatever. And now we're going to them. We're pursuing them. We say we want to sit down. I want to talk with you. So what does that look like now that we're in the right spot?
Well, I think practically there's some things. First of all, I think out of courtesy, you might want to just give that person a heads up. What is this about? If they think they're just coming to have coffee and this is great and wonderful, and then you spring this thing on them,
right?
They haven't had a time to prepare their heart. So I think out of kindness and gentleness and graciousness to that other individual, you might want to say something like, the situation occurred between us, and would love to just kind of walk through that, and would love to hear your heart, and want to resolve this. So could we get together? So I think even giving them a heads up before you get into that situation, I think is wise. So if they're a believer, they're going to take some time to prepare their heart as well. So I think that's where you start.
And I think that there's cases too where that individual might not even know that they've offended you.
Right.
And so if you show up and they think you're just going to hang out to grab coffee and cake or something, and all of a sudden you're like, "Oh, and by the way, you said this to me," and they're like, "What?" And so now they don't have the same luxury that you did of getting prepared. So I think that's really good.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just a courtesy to them. And then I think as you get into the situation, I think you have to, guard against the accusations initially. I think what's necessary from the beginning is to just say, okay, here's the situation. Here's how I perceive that. Here's how it hurt me. But maybe I didn't understand everything. I think you want to give another benefit of the doubt that perhaps we misunderstood the situation. Perhaps there's something I didn't understand. Perhaps I misread intentions or motives. And motives are always a difficult thing. Once you start talking about people's motives and reading into people's motives, 1 Corinthians 4 says only God judges the motives.
Sure.
We can't judge other people's motives. So it's very possible that we could have entirely misread their motives. So I think a critical part of that early conversation is, this is how I perceive that. Maybe I didn't accurately perceive that. So what was in your heart at that moment? Or can you help me understand? I think, some key words right there would be, can you help me understand? And James talks about the importance of being quick to listen and slow to speak. And so I think initially there should be some listening done before you really go too far down the road of really heavily confronting the individual. So those would just be a couple preliminary things.
Yeah, that's good. I think we have to make sure that we're not just going there to pridefully get our point across. As we meet with the individual, we have to let people speak, and then as they speak, don't just wait for them to take a breath so you can fill in and start talking again. Not only is that just annoying, but it's also, you're not giving the individual time to explain themselves when you have a preconceived idea of what's already going on. And so don't just wait for the breath. Like, listen to what they're saying and try to understand it. And what that'll do is then it'll bring you to, maybe like Todd was saying, their motives weren't to hurt you or to offend you, And so there was just a misunderstanding in that area. And if maybe they were, and maybe you say, well, what if they were trying to hurt me? Well, that's fine. You still have the responsibility to act and react in such a way that brings glory to God. And you sit down and you talk with that individual and you get it sorted out. And then at the end, obviously it's key that when it's done, it's done. And I think we have this, we kind of have this notion of we remember things too long. And we like to leave chapters of books open as opposed to saying, yeah, that person offended me, wronged me, whatever it was. And boy, I can't let that go. I have to hold on to that. And I think now we're getting back into like that individual's heart after somebody has repented.
Yeah, I think even practically how you work through that issue, I think sometimes we like to defend ourselves even in our forgiveness. And we phrase things like, well, if it looked like I hurt you, then please forgive me. Or if it came across this way, then please forgive me. But what you're doing in that moment is you're actually putting it back on them.
That's
So,
right.
If you perceive that this way, then you're really the one that has the problem. But I'll ask for some forgiveness if I have to.
I'm sorry that you took it that way.
I'm sorry you took it that way.
That's right.
Instead, I think in those moments where we recognize where we have offended, I think it's just better to say, you know what, please forgive me. I was wrong, please forgive me. And if they're able to do the same thing, then you have to extend the forgiveness. And this is biblical. Ephesians 4 says, forgive in the same way you have been forgiven. Matthew 18 talks about that parable of the unforgiving slave and the man who's unwilling to extend forgiveness. And what does Jesus say? He says he's cast into hell. This is the mark of an unbeliever, is to not grant forgiveness. So I think there has to be a willingness to extend that forgiveness, to ask for it transparently and openly and honestly without putting the blame on them, and then to extend that same forgiveness when asked for it.
And this isn't in our notes, but as you were speaking, something that came to mind was we also need to make sure that if somebody comes to us, that we're reacting properly. So if we've offended somebody and they're going through all of this and they come to us, or they come to you and they say, hey, can we get together? There was this time, Sunday morning, you said this. We need to make sure that our defenses don't come up and that we graciously want to meet with that person, because the purpose of that is to maintain the unity of the body. Because if you say, well, I didn't do anything wrong, and then all of a sudden those defense mechanisms come up and you start trying to say, well, I just meant this, and this is what I was trying to say over here, but that person wants to speak with you, I think you need to allow them to speak with you, because you want to make sure that the air between you is clear. So you also have a responsibility to respond when somebody comes up to you. And once again, we're all believers. And so you have a responsibility to treat someone appropriately, the same way that Christ treats you.
Yeah. The difficulty comes, and this isn't probably, we don't have probably time to deal with this. What if a situation is unresolvable? How do we handle that? To what degree are we instructed to pursue that? And that's maybe another conversation, but I would say you take it as far as you can. Romans 12:18 is as far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men.
I actually wrote that here. What if they don't want to? Romans 12:18.
We were thinking on the same wavelength. So yeah. I think you take it as far as you can. You have as many conversations as you need to have. You extend his forgiveness as much as you need to. You ask for forgiveness as much as you need to. I don't think there's a point where a believer should get to a situation where you just say, well, this situation is unresolvable. We're not going to like each other. We're just not going to like being in the same church. We're going to just avoid each other. I don't think that's a biblical place for believers to be. So I think the onus is on every believer to take it as far as they can to resolve that situation. Now, you can't control the other person's response. You can't force them to extend forgiveness. You cannot force them to reconcile with you. If that's where it is and you've tried everything you can, then you entrust that situation to the Lord. But at the same time, on our side, I don't think we can just say, well, I sent one little email and nothing happened, so I guess we're done. That's it. I'm not going to talk to that person ever again. That's not right either.
Yeah, right.
So I do think the onus is on us to pursue that situation and to pray. Maybe we should just emphasize that prayer needs to be a key part of this. Before the meeting, during the meeting, after meeting, you just need to pray. Pray for the Lord to soften your heart and soften their heart, and pray that in the end, what's really at stake here? What's at stake here is the glory of Christ.
That's right.
The unity of his body.
Actually has nothing to do with you whatsoever.
Has nothing to do with us. It's about the power of the gospel and the truth of God's word and the unity of the church. And this is maybe how we need to end up here. But if we can't resolve conflict with fellow believers, what kind of testimony is that to the watching world?
Yeah.
So, critical.
Yeah, that is the next one, right? What happens if we don't resolve conflict? So the last few minutes, we'll just kind of machine gun through these. First of all, fellowship is broken, right? So you start avoiding people, no longer, maybe your small group, you don't go to that anymore. Maybe equipping hour, maybe, the church functions that we have, theology class, all this, all of a sudden, I know they're going to be there, so I don't want to be there, right? So you no longer have that fellowship with one another. You can't practice one another's, right? So we're to bear one another's burdens, but if you have something against somebody else, how are you supposed to come alongside them and bear their burdens? One of the one another's is to forgive one another. So we're obviously not going to be practicing that either. And I would go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think Satan's greatest scheme is that he wants to bring this disunity within the church.
That's right.
And so I would say that's one of the many reasons, but one of the top reasons that it's focused on so much is to cultivate what we already have. We are unified through Christ. We're given to that. Now we're to cultivate that as believers, because Satan wants to drive us apart.
That's exactly what I was going to say. He wants us to bite and devour one another. Galatians 5:15. So failure to reconcile with one another and resolve conflict with one another ultimately plays into Satan's schemes and his desire to prowl after those whom he wants to devour. So you're exactly right. We can't practice the one another's effectively when we fail to resolve conflict.
So our vertical, or our horizontal is messed up in the church, and then our vertical gets messed up. In Psalm 66:18, if I regard iniquity in my heart, my prayers are far from you. And so now your horizontal is taken out. Your individual life in the church is no longer that effective. Now your vertical is taken out because you no longer have that close communion with God. And then Peter throws in there too that your prayers are hindered. If you have something with your wife, so if you have that personal conflict as well going on in the home. And so when we harbor those things and we're not willing to humbly come and speak to somebody about them, our entire life kind of just stops. Our spiritual life kind of just stops, and we're no longer to walk in that nice communion.
Yeah, and internally, then a root of bitterness.
And then you get the root of bitterness.
Starts to grow up, and so that begins to just destroy you from the inside out. And unfortunately, there's probably been many believers whose hearts have been ravaged by the destructiveness of bitterness.
Absolutely.
And bitterness will destroy you. It doesn't destroy other people as much as it destroys the person who's harboring it. So just internally and personally, it does a horrible damage to our own lives, because it colors everything that we see about other people. It leads us down a road of judgmental spirit and hard heart, and all of that ends up hurting people down the long run. So those are some serious consequences of failing to resolve conflict in the church.
Yeah, I love the definition of bitterness: drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And that's because a lot of times people don't even know that you're bitter against them. But
that's right.
So anyway, guys, we're glad. I hope this helps out a little bit. That you can perhaps feel more confident now and going and speaking to someone if you feel like you've been wronged, or being gracious to somebody if they feel like you've wronged them. So we're going to be going through a lot of these very practical over the next few weeks. As I said before, if you have any suggestions or ideas, feel free to shoot us an email. Otherwise, we've got a long list that we're working off of as well. So hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. It's supposed to be back to summertime for this weekend, so get out, enjoy the sunshine, and we will see you guys on Sunday.